But Ben, as we look at this, one of the other kind of little rules of thumb that I like to use, I think can be helpful in kind of navigating this age element and this trade element, because a lot of people are going to come back to us and say, well, I mean, you got to score some points on your roster, and are even going to look at this team that we drafted for this year, for year 2 in our RB Triflex, and they're looking and they're like, number one, you guys have a lot of players. You're not necessarily going to be able to move back out of all of them. You may just have to cut some of these guys that you drafted. Number 2, you're deep, but it's not a best ball. And, are you going to get the production that you need? Now, one of the things that we've done, we have Saquon Barkley, we have James Conner. Those guys are going early in redraft. It would suggest to us that we have the running back points that we need to be competitive. But there is this question out there of how do you make sure that you score points? Now, part of it is that you keep your Chases, you move your Wilsons, but there are going to be some other opportunities to move through different guys. And when you're looking at a player who you may think of as a peak type of player who you could add in sort of a 3-for-1. We talk a lot about being on the 3 side of that and diversifying your risk. In this situation, the manager who took the 3 side, immediately one of those guys got hurt, and that's unlucky for him, but at the same time, he still has Juju and Michael Thomas left. Now, we don't know if Michael Thomas is healthy either, but he's got a little bit more insulation than we do. If Saquon Barkley gets hurt, then, we've lost the trade, obviously. As we're looking at the age element for these players, I like to think in terms of when you trade for someone, you want to be able to play them for 2 years and then still trade them close to the peak. And one of the things that we see in terms of the trade value and the averages is a lot of those averages are going to be influenced by the stars jumping and then other young players falling out of the league entirely. And so the guys who fall out of the league are going to drop those averages down. And as we get each year into the league, you have more players who fall out. But you do have this sort of core group of veterans who from age 22 to 26 are probably going to play pretty well. I like to still very much target the beginning of that window, play them for a couple of years, and then move them, even if it seems like I'm moving a guy who, well, not just what it seems like, but if I'm moving a guy who's a first or second round redraft pick.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. I mean, even going after the 25, 26-year-old wide receivers, it can feel like, yeah, this guy's just entering his peak. But if you play him for 2 years, as you say, it's a lot tougher, especially if that player isn't playing at an incredibly high level. It's a lot tougher than to get peak value at 27 or 28. The point is to get familiar with those types of decisions, I think, and be willing to take the unproven player, because we talk a lot about chaos, and we're going to all off season as we start talking about redraft, and we're talking about it for just this season, how hard it is to trust projections, how much can change in season, in one football season. Now you extend that over multiple years, and I don't think most people can really grasp or fully understand the shift in player perception from one offseason to the next. Even as we sit here and can use examples from what we're thinking of players right now and say, this is what we thought of them last year. Talk about Michael Thomas or Odell Beckham or those players. Like what we were discussing with Michael Thomas last year at this time was maybe he's playing. I mean, the expectation more or less was that he was going to play last year, right? And he was only a year removed from a really great season. And so the expectation was, okay, he comes back. He's still a pretty high-level player in his prime, and he looks great. And so there's a reason to be a little bit enthusiastic about that. People were taking him in the 5th, 6th round in redraft, thinking, yeah, maybe he's not going to play for the first part of the season, but when he comes back, he's going to be Michael Thomas. You have Michael Thomas. And people are still thinking that right now. He's multiple years removed from that. It might happen, but that's not a particularly likely scenario. And more to the point is just getting familiar with the way things change. And we can't look back too far and hope, right, that things are going to go back to how they were. I mean, I think running back is the easier position. Talk about the way that Todd Gurley's value slowly eroded. And there were still people at each stage that were like, well, he's Todd Gurley, though. Like, even when he went to Atlanta, he's Todd Gurley. Like, he's going to have a good year. He had a few touchdowns that year, that first year in Atlanta. But obviously, he's essentially retired at this point, I guess, and still pretty young. David Johnson, we saw in erosion like that. Even a player who continues to produce and look good, like a Melvin Gordon, who's now at like a 29 and has been very good into the later 20s. And I think there will be more running backs in this next group than maybe in the last that are able to play past the age 25 range, because we had sort of a lull in like really strong running back prospects for a stretch there, kind of between like AP and where we are now with some of these Christian McCaffreys that are reaching their mid-20s. And AP is an example of a guy who played into his late 30s. And so you could still see some guys like that. Gordon is one in that gap that did play, until 29 and continues to play well. But even then, he was a guy looking for a decent contract this offseason, didn't get it, had to go back to his prior team on a one-year deal. Another example of a player that has pretty clearly lost a lot of value. And so you see this sort of slow erosion. If you go look at essentially any player in the NFL who's great, and this is one of the weird things about Dynasty, where you pick up a player who's young and he's great, and you're thinking, I'm going to have that guy for the next 10 years. There are not a lot of examples of players who are great for 10 years. There are very, very few, and they are the absolute best. They're the Julio Joneses. They're the Calvin Johnsons. Larry Fitzgerald did it for a long time, but I always love to bring up that he had a stretch in there where he was pretty poor for like 3 years and then had a second wind. That is absolutely the outlier. There are players that can play near those guys' level, but usually you get this peak of 3 or 4 years, and then this game just breaks players down, unfortunately. And so that's one of the big things about Dynasty as well that I try to keep in mind is you don't have as many years as you think you do. And if you're buying into a guy who's already been productive for 2 or 3 years, there's a really solid possibility that he only has 1 more year left or a couple more years left. And there's a lot of great players that's been true for. It's a tough sport in that regard. And so when you're playing Dynasty, that's the other huge element. When you were talking about that age window, everything's sort of a case-by-case basis. These are sort of these high-level brushstrokes that we're taking. But when you talk about hitting them at 22, you're talking about getting them before they even enter that peak. And then you have this potential number 1 for the massive value gain. Like even Jamar Chase at the 106 last year has gained so much value from there. You could have gotten a higher draft pick this year plus additional first-round picks if you wanted to trade out of him 1 year later. You can enter that huge peak right away and get that massive gain, and then also have multiple years of potential high-level production and a trade window at the end of that, as opposed to picking a player who's already potentially nearing the end of that window, which again, there's a lot of ways to say that. I've said a lot of times, don't pay for past production. It's just one of the unfortunate realities of the NFL. A lot of people love to look at players' past seasons and say, this is the type of player that guy is. I had a tweet recently that said that, a couple different tweets, but the sort of the too long didn't read breakdown at the end was basically at every single point, fantasy managers are too sure of what players are and what players aren't. Every offseason, every point of a player's career. I mean, I guess a thought experiment would be go to a player, and if you've been pretty tuned into fantasy, go back through their off seasons and try to think about what their perception was at each of those points and what they've actually done since and what the perception is now. And does it all fit? Because usually it doesn't. It almost never does. And so, yeah, this idea of being really confident, okay, this guy's given me this in the past. I guess Ezekiel Elliott is the guy that comes to my mind most easily. We've done this for a couple off seasons in a row now where people want to keep thinking Ezekiel Elliott has in him what he did as a rookie or a sophomore or some of those things. He's never going to have a season like that again. It's just, that's not how this game works. If he does, I will tip my cap and be so proud of him. And believe me, we are always saying we're rooting for the players. I genuinely will be impressed, and I will praise that. Readers of Stealing Signals know I was praising Derrick Henry last year when he continued to do it. What Derrick Henry did over the last 3 years is just talking about him in terms of being one of the greatest running backs of all time, what he was able to do up until that injury, because the things he continued to do are running in the face of what I just said. If Zeke has that type of year again, a 1,500-yard rushing year or what have you, I will absolutely be incredibly impressed, and that would be an amazing feat. But basically, those stats are accumulated, those seasons are over, those days are done. things always change. There's things that have changed with their offense and their offensive line. There's obviously things that have changed with Zeke. And so we've done this for a few years now with him. It's sort of the same slow erosion of value that we saw with like the Todd Gurley's and other examples, where there's still this hope that, the Cowboys love Zeke and they're going to give him a ton of work and he's going to, but what is the upside now for Zeke is the question. And it's not the 1,500 yards. It's that he can be used so heavily that he can be 75% of that maybe. But when you start to think about that and you think about his age and everything else, that's not going to get you a value gain in Dynasty. That's not going to get you anywhere. And so you have to know that the future range of outcomes for the player is not the same as the past. Things are always changing. This chaos that I was talking about, that we're talking about in redraft over multiple years is the rule. That's the world we're living in. And player value is constantly changing. And what they did in the past almost just does not matter.
So, Ben, you're talking about some running backs there, and that kind of brings us, I think, around to the other kind of foundational piece, or at least an important piece of how we build these teams. As you described Elliott's career, I'm thinking to myself, that's a great example of someone where if you had traded him after his first 3 years, you would have gotten this massive benefit of having played him, and you could trade him very, very high at that point. It wouldn't have made sense already with the minor red flags that were starting to creep in to hold on there. And it's something where if you make that trade and you lose, and he does go on a Derrick Henry type of run, again, over time and over a number of trades, you're going to come out way ahead. But how do we play the running back position, right? Because one of the elements of Dynasty is that you're going to have this team in many cases, especially after you get 2 or 3 years in, and there are other managers within your league who are doing a good job and who are building these super teams. You've got to be able to compete with them, which is one of the reasons why you need to have a very good plan and you need to build a lot of depth and a lot of talent, but you're also going to need to have a good starting lineup. It's one of the reasons that we like to have elite tight ends, not just in best ball and not just in redraft, but in Dynasty. So you get that scoring potential there. When we were looking at our team, and then when I was looking at some of these other teams that I've built, it was kind of funny after the cut down in the FFPC, where we would have like 10, 11 wide receivers and 2 running backs. But in most cases, or in many cases, those running backs were good. In our case, we had James Conner and Saquon Barkley. On the team that I have with Ben, we have Travis Etienne and Javonte Williams. We made a little trade there to actually move out of Javonte and get J.K. Dobbins, get that future pick. That one with Williams, I think, is the perfect example of this perpetual reload, because we actually didn't even get the performance from Williams. There were just a game or 2 in there, and it came in a season where we weren't competitive, but you still have to be willing to say, I'm going to have a better overall team if I move this young player. Maybe he becomes Ezekiel Elliott and you definitively lose, but over time you win. Monty and I were in a situation where we didn't have good backs, but then we made that Joe Burrow for Jonathan Taylor trade because of the overall depth that we have built.